It works. It's perfect.
So thank you very much to Wolfram, to Ravindra, and everyone else who's put this session together. Much appreciated. We really do appreciate your efforts on behalf of the needs in Africa in general. I'm talking today on this question of African concrete durability challenges. Initially, it was intended to be specific challenges, but afterwards I thought, no, an overview is maybe more appropriate. And as it turns out, my talk has really been given 3 times over this morning by the previous speakers. So this makes my job very easy because you're going to hear a lot of the same thing, but repetition in this case, I think, is valuable. I want to acknowledge my co-author, not co-presenter, but certainly co-author of this presentation, Mr. Manuel Leo, a PhD student in our concrete materials research unit in the University of Cape Town. He was very helpful in putting this together. So this is broadly what I want to speak about, an introduction on cement and concrete, vernacular materials, and some of the challenges for Africa. A lot of the points made already will be reiterated in these points. And then some of the solutions to those challenges. Obviously the solutions relate to the challenges themselves. So one goes back to look at what the challenge means, and we'll bring this to a close thereafter. This point has been made today already, and I need to make it again, that concrete is and will be the dominant building material of the future. This graph is a well-known one, really needs to be updated to the 2020 time.
Sorry to interrupt, Professor, can you switch the full screen mode, because we can only see the first slide.
I am already on slide 3 and I am on full screen. So I'm not quite sure
Mark, I think you shared the wrong side of the screen. Are you using 2 monitors? Because we are just seeing, or maybe you have to switch on the presentation mode.
Let me see. Can you see anything now?
No, we see the same as before. Maybe you
have to stop sharing and then share it again.
Okay, I will do that. So I should stop sharing. I have this in front of me now. Get out of this.
Well, we see the screen moving. Maybe you can go to full screen mode and then we'll see if it changes.
How do you see now?
Yes, now we see the sharing is started, but please go to the stop presenter mode. So you see the circle with the 3 dots below your screen.
Yes,
so if you click on that, you will see hide presenter view. Yeah, if you can click on hide. Yeah, now you're all set.
Okay. Well, I learned something about technology every day. Mostly about IT, I think. Can you see this well enough now?
Yes, we see your slide number 3.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Thank you for getting me back on track. This is a well-known slide, and we can see here the fact that concrete is going to be, and is already, of course, the dominant material of the future. Here we see world population, we see steel production, and we see cement production, and it's quite clear that cement production is the material that is increasing at an exponential rate. And the reason is simple. The world population is increasing, the world is urbanizing, and concrete is required to meet the needs of the growing population and the growing urban populations throughout the world. This is a further graph which simply illustrates the question of urbanization of the world. And if we look at Africa in particular, up here, we see that whereas in 2015, approximately 42% of the continent was urbanized, by 2050, that will rise to 56%. And this represents literally hundreds of millions of people who will be moving into the cities, who will require all the amenities in terms of infrastructure, housing, water supply, transportation, and so on, that will be expected of these cities. And here is an example of a more formal city. This is downtown Dar es Salaam, and you can see the level of development within that city. and the amount of concrete that would be used in cities of this nature. And bear in mind that by the middle of this century, Africa will have many of the largest cities in the world within its region. And if you look here, this is the other side of the urban problem, the so-called informal settlements. Here is an informal settlement in my own city, Cape Town. You can see the iconic Table Mountain in the background. And if you look in the foreground, you see the semi-formal housing here, mainly of metal sheeting. But if people want to build permanent structures that they can regard as being for them and their children, look at what they build. There in the middle of the picture, they build a concrete building. This will be a concrete block or a concrete brick house. So they turn to this material when they want permanence, when they want durability, when they want to feel as if they've put a stake in the ground and they are going to stay. That is the material that they look for, which is very significant. And then we've heard the story about Portland cement, that in itself, it is a high emitter material and a high energy material, but by the time you put it into concrete, of course, that comes down substantially. And so we need to move to this idea of using more blended cements. And Manu has given us a very good background on this, where he has pointed out the benefit, but also the difficulties in terms of convincing practitioners and also industry and governments in moving more along this role of blended cements, where we can replace the clinker content by the supplementary cementitious materials. This is an interesting slide from the UNEP report, where if you look at the use of cement in broadly in our society, you can actually see that in sort of developing countries, this is an example of cement, but it's very similar to South Africa and possibly similar to the rest of Africa, but maybe not exactly. But the vast majority of cement actually is incorporated into mortar, not into concrete. A good proportion goes into cement-based products. These would be precast mostly, plain or unreinforced concrete, and reinforced concrete, which occupies so much of our attention because of the durability issues, largely around corrosion, of course, only represents around about 25% of the total cement usage. So we also have to think about the cement usage in these other applications when we start thinking about improving the sustainability of construction in general. And that is something we must bear in mind. And so my statement here is that with this as a background, durability problems in Africa will inevitably mirror those elsewhere around the globe. After all, we're dealing with exactly the same material, maybe slightly different cements and so on, but essentially the same material. We have climates and environments that will have the same effect on these materials, and so we're going to have the similar problems. But there will be very definitely regional focuses dependent on the materials themselves and on the particular climatic situation that would apply in those regions. We will therefore have extensive use of concrete and concrete-related products with associated durability issues, and these are the things we want to tackle. We should not forget the vernacular materials, though. Here are some very interesting slides of different kinds of vernacular materials around the continent, but mostly based on earth construction. And to me, it would be a great pity if we were to lose the skill and knowledge of these materials, because they can make a substantial contribution to the needs of the population in the future. Interestingly enough, this is an artist's rendition of a new building about to be built in Johannesburg, the Thabo Mbeki Presidential Library building, which is going to be constructed of earth materials. So here is a return, if you like, to the vernacular in a very large and very iconic building. And this, as I said, I think is a very laudable development, because it indicates that we can use these materials even for sophisticated structures going down the road. Now, what about the durability challenges? Well, as I've said already, talking first about the technical side, the durability problems are not unique. One of our problems, certainly in Africa, is this question of imported solutions to these technical problems. We have inappropriate standards and practices that are often simply imported from other parts of the world and not always suited to conditions here. The reason for this importation is quite simple. It's usually linked to project funding and international contractors. So an international contractor is given a job, maybe even a funded project in Africa. The government of that contractor will fund the project, And of course, where does the money go? It goes straight back to the funding country. It never even finds much application within the continent. And we even have situations here where an entire construction crew arrives with the laborers and all imported from elsewhere, builds a project, departs, has absolutely no impact on the local transfer of skills or lifting up the local community, and leaves behind a structure that is often inappropriate and now has to be paid for to the host or to the funder. And that just ties the whole situation up in a debt spiral. And that is certainly something that we should avoid. We do, of course, have the issue of the lack of technical and scientific knowledge. Not always and not in every case, but broadly across the continent, we have a lot of work to do here in improving our technical and scientific knowledge and expertise going into the future. There is this lack of industrial byproducts for direct application as SCMs. We'll talk a bit more about that just now. And then we have a highly segmented construction material sector. For example, the fact that most of the cement actually is still sold in bags, not in construction projects that are well controlled. It means that we have a sort of an interrupted supply chain and value chain where we cannot exercise control or proper quality down the links of that chain because of the segmented sector. As far as the technical durability challenges, well, as I've said, these will be much the same as elsewhere. We know, for example, one of the big ones is alkali-silica reaction. We have major issues not only in South Africa, but particularly in Cape Town on this issue. And Charlwood, for example, has documented AAR problems in at least 9 African countries with substantial number of water retaining structures there. Here's an example of the Owen Falls or the Nalibali Dam in Uganda on the White Nile, which has got substantial ASR problems and has had for the last 40 or 50 years that the dam has been there. However, it has continued to function, but of course it has led to problems in having to continually reseat the machinery and make sure that things are running properly. There will be problems elsewhere, and this is compounded by a lack of appropriate SCMs, as I mentioned. Then also, this has been mentioned, coastal construction. Africa has a very long coastline. Populations are clustered around the coastal cities, and so all the infrastructure durability problems concerning those issues will exist in compounded form, and that has already been referred to very well by Manu. This is a slide too that many will be familiar with, showing the availability of SCMs broadly around the world, and one can see, for example, the slags and fly ashes here, cement filler, meaning mainly limestone, ground limestone, and then calcined clay. As far as Africa is concerned, and this we've seen as well, the possibilities are largely around use of vegetable ashes, natural pozzolands, the fillers being the limestones, and then substantial opportunity exists for calcined clay, particularly because these colonitic clays are in abundance in regions of East Africa, West Africa, and to a limited extent in South Africa. So here is a great opportunity to utilize these materials as well. Slag and fly ash are not easily available in Africa. As it turns out, in South Africa, we have a reasonable supply of these materials, but this is not true throughout the rest of the continent. So major opportunities exist in research and application for African-derived SCMs. Then the challenges to me are much more around the educational aspects. The technical challenges usually we can solve, but it's how to educate, it's how to train, it's how to produce adequate facilities and make these available, expertise and experience. This is, to me, the largest challenge. Well, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I suppose, we could just go and read this textbook that I produced, but as I said, that's very tongue-in-cheek. It's unlikely that Africa will move strongly into remote robotic construction in the near future. But I think that digitalization, for example, BIM, can assist in ensuring better standards of workmanship, and we're already beginning to see that, and to create a better integrated value chain in construction. But again, we cannot generalize for all of Africa in this regard. So let's think about some of the solutions. Well, the solutions really come back to this question again of education, training, and support. We need appropriate curricula and course materials for educating the next generation of African scientists. There's a paper here by Wolfram Schmidt and his co-authors which you could have a look at there in CCR. And that certainly lays out some very interesting ideas about education for the African situation in particular. And then the investigation and use of African natural materials for construction. I've already noted about the natural pozzolands that we can use, the calcine clays. This is a vast area that can be exploited, particularly in those countries which do not have industrial SCMs, and limestone fillers, and Manu has addressed that very well. And Kolawole addressed the issue of materials for admixtures and additives, African-derived materials here, rather than relying on very expensive imported materials. And then, of course, the ongoing use of the vernacular materials. And then I think that if this is something that is close to my own heart, is the development of research clusters and networks. I was so delighted to see the idea of the Rilem Youth Council putting this idea on the table and bringing together young people around the Rilem banner throughout Africa. And I think this is something that could be extremely exciting. Just as a matter of interest, we have been working on SCMs, other types of SCMs at the University of Cape Town. We've had a project by Alice Becerra on use of metacaolin in Western Cape concretes, and then a current project by Manuel Leo, the co-presenter or co-author of this presentation, and he's looking at the development of low clinker concretes and partial replacement of cement with calcine clay and limestone using selected African raw materials. And he's looking at clays from East Africa and some clays from South Africa, and already producing some very interesting results. So we are doing some work on this, but this needs to be expanded very substantially. This is this question of networks. This slide is taken from the IC conference back in January 2019 in Nairobi, and I want to acknowledge Gladwin Ganga for this. And here the idea is of developing these networks, and if the Rilem Youth Council can do this successfully, that will be a tremendous move forward. And I think here really the important issue is the extrinsic factors, the role of mentors and promoters, institutional support, support by the institutions themselves, as well as funding. And here I think that we haven't really exploited the possibility of industrial funding properly. There has to be industrial funding available in my view, and we haven't seen that coming through adequately at this stage, but that will be very necessary to allow these networks to flourish. So that's the point that I want to simply put on the table and see how we can develop that further. And I also have to acknowledge that Wolfram has done tremendous work here in bringing together African scholars. I often say of Wolfram, he's a more enthusiastic African than I am. And I really mean that. He's a great tonic to us here and a great help. So for fostering research networks in Africa, Rilem, I think, is a very convenient vehicle and should be much more exploited in that regard. And then the question of standards. We really do need to develop African design codes. Limited efforts have been made so far. There was an African Design Code Committee put together 10 or 15 years ago, but it never got too far down the road. And this problem that often standards are simply adopted again from abroad without consideration of historical background. We do need to develop local standards here that are applicable to our own conditions here. And that doesn't mean that in many cases these other codes and standards cannot be used, but certainly would need to be adapted or developed or modified in some way. Then let me put this on the table as well. I think that if we can expand the opportunities for international internships and then allow these young people who have been in international internships to come back into the African context and apply that knowledge. And that would be an ongoing boost to the need for developing African solutions. EPFL have got these internships. BAM does a great job in providing these. Of course, they're limited in number, but maybe these could be expanded as well. So let me bring this presentation to a close. Just again to say that cement and concrete will remain the dominant material in the future for meeting Africa's urbanization and built infrastructure needs. We can see that, but it's not necessarily the cement and concrete that we're using today. We need to develop these materials, use African developed and derived supplementary materials, and change the nature of the material locally as well. We should not forget vernacular materials. I still think there's a great potential there. The durability challenges in regard to concrete are not going to be different from elsewhere, but with fewer technical resources to meet those challenges, this will be largely the issues that we will face. Like advanced testing and analytical facilities, for example, may be a major issue. So I see the main challenges not as technical, but as educational, vocational, and in the research area. And that's, I think, where we need to be putting our attention. And the proposed solutions here are to look at appropriate curricula, appropriate vocational training, fostering research networks and internships, looking at the question of standards, and then also, I mentioned already, international internships. So with that, I want to thank you for listening to me this morning, Asante, and if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark, for keeping excellently the time, which gives us a little bit time to, although we started with a bit of delay, to raise a few questions. And I've observed the chat with excitement, and both chats in the Zoom, in the small Zoom conference, as well as in the larger YouTube live stream. And I think I can summarize a few of those things that I could read from these messages, and many of them were related to lack of standards and also to the communication to different players in the field, from the young ones to the very old ones to the established ones, which are their roles. So obviously there seems to be a gap in the communication between the different players in the field. You've been inspiring a lot of young researchers, generations of researchers. Maybe some of them have been a professor for a while already in the meantime, and everybody really, I mean, what can I say? You are kind of a legend in Africa and in the academic area. But what are the steps that need to be taken to bring this into the practice, to those people who create the standards, to those people who make policies, to those people who are the practitioners at the end of the day? Could you elaborate on that? What would be required?
Yeah, well, that is a very tricky question, because Africa is such a diverse continent. We do now have exciting developments. I mean, the African Union is beginning to flex its muscles and become, I think, a far more effective body. We have now, just in the last month, we've had the establishment of the largest free trade area in the world through the African Free Trade Union, Free Trade Agreement that has been signed by every African state except one. So I think this is a developing field. I do think that these kinds of bodies can be of great assistance in putting these things on the agenda, but they won't put them on the agenda unless there is pressure brought by the practitioners themselves. So that is, we in Africa need to be bringing these things to the attention of our own governments and asking them to take them forward. However, that doesn't mean that we can't do more informal, networking around these issues. For example, here in South Africa, we have adopted the EN specs, largely because Europe is one of our largest trading partners. But we are constantly in contact with the EN body for adapting and making these far more applicable for the Southern African situation with the good success. So there's that possibility as well. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach, and others may have better ideas than I do, but that would be my take on it at this stage.
And another issue that I noted from the chat was related to the earthen materials, and I love the slide that you showed with all those wonderful and beautiful shell structures that have been built based on research as well over the course of the history. And you also said it would be a pity if this skill to build these structures would get lost with time. So what can be done in order to maintain the skill, but also to upgrade it to the new knowledge that we do have, for example, in analytics, to analyze about hazardous constituents in these materials and so on. So how can we link the history with the future, which we don't know yet?
Yeah, these are difficult questions, Wolfram, if I may say so.
I'm sorry.
I pointed out that in that informal settlement in Cape Town, when people want permanence, when they want to have a sense of place and a home that they can feel safe and secure in and use as a base, what do? They turn to concrete. There's this idea that you need a solid house. Sadly, in many cases, this means that those vernacular techniques are being lost. But this new Taub-Mbeki library, I think, will bring some of those materials back on the table again, if we can have a couple more of these iconic structures. The interesting thing here, at least in my part of the world, is that this kind of technology, these vernacular materials, are actually sought after by the rich. It's the rich people who want this because they see them as something of a status. So the poor people want concrete, the rich people want earth. Now that's almost a reversal of the way it is in other parts. So a lot of it has to do with social acceptance. A lot of it has to do with the way the architects also develop this, because we should understand that the building sector is largely dominated by architects. And so I think there's a huge role here for them to promote this kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you very much.